very excited to be here today for deploying mobile apps to test devices. So I am Cecilia Martinez. I am the developer advocate for Appflow. Appflow is the mobile CI/CD platform built by Ionic. You can feel free to connect with me on Twitter at Cecilia Creates. And I'm also joined here today by Ashwini. Hi, Ashwini.
Hi, hello everyone.
Ashwini Shukla is a product manager, one of our product managers for Appflow here as well. And you can feel free to connect with her on LinkedIn if you'd like to follow up with either of us. So we're here today to talk about a very complex topic, which is mobile testing, specifically how you test your mobile applications on specific devices. So before we get started, I'd love to get a sense of the experience here today. And we're going to start with a poll. So we can kick off a poll here. And the question is, what mobile testing methods do you use at your company? So we're going to go ahead and launch that on your screen, and you can select between automated testing, manual testing, or both automated and manual testing. You'll notice there's not an option for no testing. So hopefully you're doing some kind of testing of your mobile applications before they're released to users. And if you're doing anything unique, or you have maybe like a specific solution that you're using for testing your mobile apps, please feel free to also put that in the chat. We'd love to get a sense of what people are doing out there when it comes to testing. So I'll give a minute here for people to vote. Again, what mobile testing methods do you use at your company? All right, and once we've had a chance for folks to be able to select, we will go ahead and share those results when they're ready. All right, yeah, so looks like 2% are doing just automated testing, 62% are doing manual testing only, and 37% of you are doing a mix of both. So not totally surprised to see that answer. I come from a web development background, specifically web testing. I've worked with open source web testing tools. And there's a lot of automation in web development, but in mobile development, we do see a lot of manual testing. So today we'll be talking about both manual and automated testing. So hopefully there'll be plenty for y'all to learn and take back to your teams. So when it comes to testing mobile apps, you do have quite a bit of options and things to consider. In my opinion, maybe too many options, right? There's a lot of things that you need to think about when it comes to developing your testing strategy. You need to think about, are you going to do automated versus manual testing? So as you saw, more than a third of you use a little bit of both. But then you also need to think about the ratio of automated to manual and which test cases you're going to automate versus keep in a manual testing method. You also need to think about whether you're going to use real or virtual devices. Again, you may end up using a bit of both, but understanding at what point in the testing process are you going to use a virtual versus a real device, as well as what types of testing to do on each. There's also the supported devices that you need to consider. Most organizations will have a supported device matrix, but then you need to think about which devices are most important to actually test on. Maybe there's specific platforms that give you trouble, or a certain type of device or a version of a device that has more edge cases that you need to account for. So you need to consider whether real device testing is more important for those types of platforms versus others. You also need to consider your manual test channels. Now, when I say manual test channels, what I'm referring to is the way that you deliver the test versions of your applications to your manual testers, to your QA team, to your test team. How do you actually get the app version into their hands? You can do this in a couple of different ways, a couple of different methods. You also need to think about test frequency. So how often are you running tests, and at what point in the testing process are you running certain types of tests? And then finally, the release promotion criteria. At what point do you feel confident that your app has been tested enough to actually promote it to a release to users? So fortunately, Appflow is here to help you test your mobile applications. Appflow, as I mentioned, is a mobile CI/CD platform built by Ionic, and it's designed with developers in mind. It's designed to help developers simplify the build and upload process of their applications so that they can focus on just creating and developing really great apps for their end users. So the way that we help you with deploying to test devices is in a couple of ways. We provide cloud native builds for virtual and real devices. And when I say cloud native builds, I'm referring to both iOS and Android native builds. We also allow you to automate your deployments to test channels. So whether you're using Google Play Test Tracks, Test Flight, various different channels, we help to automate those uploads to the app stores, as well as allow you to integrate with real device automation. And we're going to talk about some of these examples today, as well as some general best practices when it comes to deploying your test devices. So in order to cover all this, we do have a very packed agenda. There is a lot to dig into when it comes to mobile testing. So first, we're going to talk about your virtual and real device test options. Then we're going to talk about automating testing on real devices with an example. Then delivering apps to manual testers, so you know how to leverage those test channels, as well as dig into some test deployment strategies that you can take back and implement on your team. And then last but certainly not least, we have a sneak peek at a new Appflow feature related to testing devices. So make sure that you stick around for that, as well as the Q&A at the end. So as Diana mentioned, please feel free to leverage the Q&A throughout the presentation if any questions come up, and we will definitely get to those at the end. All right, so there's a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and dig in, and we'll start with test devices. So with test devices, the first option that you have is virtual devices. Now, virtual devices are essentially a software device that replicates a real device, and it runs on your machine. For Android, we have emulators. And for iOS, we have simulators. So there are some small technical specifications that make an emulator different from a simulator, but ultimately they're both going to be a piece of software that you interact with as if it were a real device. Android emulators and iOS simulators are both pre-installed with the developer tools that you use to build these applications. So in Android Studio, there comes pre-installed with emulators, but also an Android device manager that you can use to configure your devices, as well as there's a simulator built into iOS that allows you to launch different types of devices. Virtual devices can be used for manual or automated testing. So you can either open your application in a simulator or emulator and then interact with it for manual testing, or you can set it as the target for an automated test. So let's take a look at an example of setting an automated test target with a virtual device. So here in my screen, hopefully y'all can see that. I can make the text bigger if I need to. This is an Appium test. So Appium is an end-to-end testing framework that allows you to test on Android and iOS. This is using the Node Selenium WebDriver version of Appium. And here we can see that I'm setting up my configuration for my test. I'm testing on Android, and I'm using an Android device. Here, I'm referencing the location of my APK that is going to be used to launch and then drive the test. My test itself is very straightforward. I'm essentially opening my app and clicking on a couple of tabs because we want to just keep it straightforward for demonstration purposes. But what I want to have is the emulator here running on my machine, which I do. I have my Android emulator here. It feels like a real phone. I can interact with it. I can do different things. I can set device dark mode, things like that. But if I go ahead and start my Appium server, and then I run my test, so Node, probably easier if I just, and I run my test, what that's going to do, it's going to launch that app debug APK on the emulator, and it's going to drive my application and click on the tabs and run my test. So that is how you essentially can set a virtual device to run your automated test. And you can do the same thing with an iOS simulator as well. In addition to running automated tests, you can also do manual tests by interacting with a simulator or an emulator. So iOS simulator builds are a really helpful way for getting versions of your application out to testers and stakeholders, because simulator builds are the only type of build that does not require signing. So if you are familiar with signing or generating signed bundles of your mobile application, For iOS, you do have to use signing credentials for any type of build that will run on an actual physical device. So this makes it a little bit more complex in order to create these bundles because you have to deal with signing credentials. But with iOS simulator builds, you can run them on any kind of simulator without having to sign the bundle. So iOS simulator builds, you can create simulator builds in Appflow, and they can be installed on any simulator device. You simply download the bundle and then unzip it. And then in order to install any type of binary on a simulator or emulator that's not running on your machine, you just drag the file onto the simulator in order to run it. This allows you to interact with your application. And it's, like I said, it's really helpful for that early stage testing or distributing to stakeholders. But they do have to have that simulator device on their machine. So they do have to have Xcode installed there. They have to have a way to run that simulator once they actually receive the app file. So keep that in mind as well. All right, then we have real devices. And when I'm talking about real devices, I'm referring to the real hardware physical device that you can run your application on. So real devices ultimately will give you the best fidelity of user experience. What this means is that you are going to see exactly how your application will run when your user uses it on their device, right? So ultimately, that's why we see a lot of manual testing, because we need to actually be able to interact with real devices. So for iOS, real devices must be registered and listed in the provisioning profile. I just mentioned that simulator builds are the only type that don't need to be signed. If you are running any kind of iOS app on a real device, you do need to register all the devices that you intend to run that app on and list it in your signing credentials. It's different for App Store builds because those are going to go through the App Store approval process. But for everything else, you do have to identify those UUIDs for your devices and make sure that they're registered. Again, this can make it a little bit more complex to test iOS. Everything seems to be a little bit more complex on iOS. But it's good to have some kind of process in place to register or manage those devices if you do plan on distributing them to test devices. So you can register real devices, or you can use them by connecting the device to a dev machine. So if you are running your application locally, you can connect your device to the machine and be able to load it onto your real device. Or you can download and install the binary on your device. So if you do this, you will have to kind of for example, make sure developer mode is on, bypass some security warnings whenever you're installing a binary that's not via an app store. But that is the other process for getting an app on a real device, is actually using the device to go to a server, be able to download the binary, and then install it. So real devices, just like virtual devices, can be used for manual or automated testing. And so a lot of times you think of real devices with manual testing, but it is possible to also automate testing on real devices using what we refer to as a device farm. So we're going to talk next, and we're going to dig into some examples of how you can automate testing on real devices. And we're going to do that using Appflow and Sauce Labs. So Sauce Labs is just one of the options that you have for real device farms. There's also AWS has a device farm. There's Browser Stack. So we're using Sauce Labs today as an example because it does allow you to connect to real iOS and Android devices in the cloud. You can either interact with devices live for manual testing, or you can also run automated tests against real devices. And it also allows you to see those test results, videos, and logs of those real device interactions. The first scenario that we're going to take a look at is on-demand testing. So on-demand testing allows you to upload your app binary to Sauce Labs. You can then interact with it in Sauce Labs for live interactive testing on a real device, or you can also run automated tests from a local environment. So let's go ahead and take a look. And let's see. So here is my Sauce Labs app management. Let's go ahead and refresh that. And so we can see these are the apps that have been uploaded. So you can drag and drop, a new version. So you have like a new APK version or IPA version of your test application, upload it here, and then you can interact with it live, for example, by selecting a real device, or you can also interact with real devices via our automated tests. So earlier I showed you this Appium test here. I also have a Sauce Labs version of this test. So the differences are in my capabilities that I'm setting for my Appium test. Instead of referring to a local file location that has my APK, I'm referring to a file name that corresponds to the mobile app in Sauce Labs. I'm also referring to a device name that again refers to a device name in Sauce Labs. And finally, I'm sending through a build ID that will identify this build that I'm running my test against. Here in my actual run test function, I'm using my Sauce Labs user and key, as well as setting that remote host name. And what that will do is now if I were to run, my node Sauce Labs test.js file, that is now going to run the same test, but it's going to interact with a Sauce Labs server, run the test on that Samsung device instead. So this is how you can do what I call on-demand testing, which is to say, yes, run my test now, but it's manually triggered by a developer or by a tester. The next scenario that we'll take a look at is how you can do this automated from CI/CD. So everything that we just talked about, you can also do from a CI/CD pipeline. And this is possible by leveraging Appflow's Ionic Cloud CLI. So if you are building with Appflow using our servers for cloud native Android and iOS binaries, you can then upload that binary via the Sauce Labs API to Sauce Labs, and then trigger the test run from your CI/CD pipeline. So this allows you to also set the binary name and build ID dynamically at test runtime. This allows us to have really helpful build IDs that can reference either like a build ID, it can reference a commit SHA, you can kind of name it anything that makes sense for your testing practices, all within your own CI/CD environment. So the Appflow Ionic Cloud CLI allows you to interact with all of Appflow's functionality from any CI/CD environment. It essentially allows you to do your cloud native builds, upload to app stores, or also live updates without having to go into the Appflow dashboard. So it can be really helpful if you need to orchestrate your own more complex workflows, such as interacting with a Sauce Labs API to run your tests. So we're going to take a look at some examples of how that works. So we took a look at our Sauce Labs test here. And what we want to essentially do is be able to run this test in a CI/CD environment. But we need to have the newest test version of our application uploaded to Sauce Labs in order to do that. And so I'm going to be using a GitHub Actions example. I'll go ahead and make the font bigger here as we're looking at code, make it nice and big so hopefully everyone can read this. And this is a GitHub Actions workflow, but you can use any CI/CD environment. You can use Jenkins, Circle CI, GitLab, anything that you use to build pipelines out. I just use GitHub Actions. And so what this does is every time that I push to my main branch, and you could have a test branch, a release branch, a Sauce Labs branch, whatever it may be, I am going to trigger this workflow. This is running on a Linux machine. I am doing an Android build in this workflow. However, if I were doing an iOS build, the great thing about using Appflow is that the build actually happens on Appflow's server. So I can trigger an iOS build using a Linux machine. I don't have to provision any of my own Mac hardware because Appflow takes care of that for me. But here I'm running an Android build. I have some environment variables that I'm setting. Specifically, you'll notice I have my Sauce Labs user and key, and I'm creating a variable here called APK file name. I'm using the GitHub SHA or the GitHub commit ID in order to name my APK. That allows me to be able to easily reference what commit created that build so I can organize it or be able to find that later for debugging purposes. So again, having an organized strategy for how you're going to name and reference things can be really helpful for your testers. I'm just checking out my code. I do have my test code and my app code living together in this example. Again, the nice thing about using Ionic, the Appflow servers for the builds is I don't have to do that. I could have a separate test code repo, have all of my app code live somewhere else. And as but still use Appflow servers to create the build because Appflow is the one that actually checks out my code. But here I am checking out my code because I want to run my test, and my test code and my app code lives in the same repo. Here I'm installing the Ionic Cloud CLI. This allows us to run the command to build our debug APK. So I am passing through my app ID, which corresponds to my app and Appflow, the commit SHA that I'm using to create the build, as well as that custom APK name that I've created. This will save the APK in my local environment so that I can then use it to upload to Sauce Labs. In my next step, I'm now taking that APK that was generated and then sent back from the Appflow servers to Sauce Labs. So I'm running a curl command to interact with the Sauce Labs API. This is actually, Sauce Labs generates the code for you to be able to do this, the command. Passing through my username and my key. And I can see here that my payload is that same APK file name that I just created. So everything is going to be the same name coming from Appflow going up to Sauce Labs. And then finally, I'm going to run my test. So I'm starting my Appium server and I'm running that node Appium/saucelabs test.js file and setting some environment variables for my test, including my Sauce Labs user and key and that same APK file name. And that's important because I want to make sure that I'm testing against that file that I just uploaded. So I'm testing against the newest version of my test build that was triggered from that commit. Appflow built it for me. We uploaded it to Sauce Labs, and now I'm running my test against that very same build. So this is an example of what it looks like when you run that. So this was triggered from a commit to main. This is my GitHub Actions workflow. And so we can see here, I installed the Ionic Cloud CLI. It took less than a second. This is where I'm building the debug APK. Again, everything is happening on Appflow servers, but if I scroll down to the bottom after everything has been built, I can see that here is where the artifact is that APK that has that commit SHA as the file name. We are then uploading that same APK with the same file name up to the Sauce Labs server, and I can see that all here. And then finally, here is where I'm running my test. I can see here that the app name is that commit SHA.apk that is in this cloud environment here. I'm running my test and I can see the results coming back from my test. I can also in Sauce Labs come to my test results and I can see the results of that test. So this is that same commit SHA that was used to generate the build and run the test against. And I can see a video and I can see the logs and the network of my test running on the actual Samsung Galaxy S9 device, not browser. And so they do have the devices clean between each test, but here I can see the recording of it opening the application and clicking through my tabs. So if I needed to do any debugging or see what happened during the test if something went wrong, I can access it and then I can go back, I can find the commit SHA here. As well as, again, even though I was initiating everything from GitHub Actions, everything does get saved to Appflow. So at any time, I can come back here, I can view the build log, I can download any of the artifacts, and I can also, again, see what commit it was associated with. So really, by leveraging the power of both using the cloud for your builds, as well as using the cloud to access your real devices, you can automate your entire testing workflow. And again, we're setting that binary name and build ID dynamically so that your testers or nobody has to worry about trying to match everything up after the fact. All right, so we talked about test devices, real and virtual, and how we can automate. Now let's talk about manual testing. We're going to talk about how you can deliver your apps to manual testers. So first thing I want to do is actually I want to get a sense of, again, a read of the room. We'll start with a poll. So how does your team deliver your apps to testers? So we'll go ahead and launch the poll now. And either you manually distribute your native binaries, you use either Google Play Console test tracks or App Store Connect test flight or something else. And if you use something else, please specify in the chat. And we'll give folks a minute to answer the question. So how does your team deliver your apps to testers? Okay, yes, so say if people who, and if you do both, that's fine too. You can select one or the other and then just specify in the chat. So. All right, so give a couple more seconds here for folks to answer, and then we will go ahead and share the results. Looks like I have a couple people who use both. Okay. All right, so yep, so it looks like we do have some people in the chat saying that they use both, which is helpful to know. So we do have about 40%, 39% say they manually distribute the native binaries. Half of y'all use Google Play Console test tracks or test flight, and about 11% use other, or perhaps both of the first two options. So there's still, so it looks like is quite a bit of manual distribution taking place, but y'all are also leveraging these kind of more formal tracks in order to distribute for testers. And see a couple of people responding in the chat with some additional tools and solutions that they use. So we can cover some of the examples that we talked about here. The first is manual delivery, right? So when you talk about manual delivery, is that testers download and install the binaries themselves from some sort of centralized location. It could be a specific tool that you use. Well, actually, I'm sorry, this is not using any kind of like app delivery tool where everything is managed for you. I've heard people say that they kind of just, upload the binary, use quick share, maybe have some kind of any kind of centralized storage, and then the testers will go in, get that new version and install it themselves. This can be difficult to track versions or know when new releases are ready. So this is typically, we see this used when either there's not, like maybe for smaller testing teams, or if you have a more manual testing process, or if you're able to organize or track some of that information elsewhere, where you may not have like, hundreds of versions that may exist at any given time for different testers. So let's talk about Google Play test tracks. So Google Play has some built-in functionality to allow you to test your application and then promote it up till it's finally ready for release. This is built into Google Play Console. So when you first upload your binary for the first time, you can set it up for internal testing. Internal testing allows you to make your app available to up to 100 testers, and that is set by email address. You add testers to an internal testing track, and then you are able to release new versions of your application to that testing track and make it available to testers. After that, you have alpha, or what's called closed testing track. So you're able to either create a new alpha release directly, or you can promote something from internal testing up to alpha. Alpha allows you to test with a wider audience. And then once that's completed, you have beta, or what's called open testing. So open testing or beta testing, at that point, your app should really, it needs to be configured and ready for the App Store, the Google Play Store, because it's going to be essentially distributable, but marked as beta. And as you move through these tracks, again, you can upload new versions, you can promote new versions to different tracks once they're ready, until they're ultimately ready for release. On the iOS side, you have essentially two options for distributing to testers. You do have those development builds, but those are a little bit tricky to distribute wider. So you also have ad hoc builds. Ad hoc builds allow you to distribute up to 100 devices. So it's device-based, not tester-based. So if you have, some devices that are registered that you have as an organization, if you have like a device management that you're using, you can leverage ad hoc releases or ad hoc builds in order to distribute to those devices that you have at your organization. You do still have to have them all registered. So, but once you create a provisioning profile that contains all of those UUIDs, you can do ad hoc builds, and then those builds can be distributed to any of the testers that, any of the test devices that you have, but ultimately the testers who are using those test devices. If you need to test with a wider audience, then there is Test Flight. So Test Flight is built in to App Store Connect, and it allows you to release to a much wider audience. The way that it works is end users or your testers download a Test Flight app on their phone, and then once new versions of the test app is available to them, they're notified and they're able to interact with that new version. You're able to upload new versions of your app. You're able to set test details, like essentially kind of like test release notes, and then add groups and individual testers. You can also enable automatic sharing that once a new version has been released, then they'll get an email and it'll automatically be available to them. And so we can take a look at these two different options, but specifically the nice thing about them is that you can automate both of these types of release channels using Appflow. So Appflow allows you to create automations that will trigger whenever you push to a specific branch, just like how my GitHub Actions workflow did. However, these automations are built within Appflow with a nice kind of graphical user interface that you can design your workflow. So for example, I can say whenever I trigger push to my main branch, create a new App Store build type using my signing certificate, and then I want you to distribute it to test flight. Then it will be available for your testers. So in Appflow, you can add and manage track destinations, both with Google Play and then also with the App Store. You can trigger automated uploads of those new builds, and then the new version is delivered and ready for testing. So what that looks like in Appflow, I'm gonna come here to a different app. So this is just like a React Native app that I have, but it's set up with some automations. So every time that I push to my main branch, it creates a release Android build and it uploads it to Google Play. It also creates an App Store build type and it uploads it to my test flight destination. These destinations are managed here within my Appflow. So I have these set up here. And when I come to my builds, I can see that my builds here were triggered from that push to main, and they were deployed to test flight and Google Play internal. So in my internal testing dashboard here, I can see that my previous version with a version code of 19, which is already available to testers. I have a new version with the version code of 22. So I'm auto incrementing my build, my versions is available to be released to my internal testers. This is automatically uploaded from Appflow. The same thing in App Store Connect. I have my test flight version. This one was created a couple weeks, like a week or I don't know, a week and a half ago. That's already been distributed, but I have a new version that was uploaded from Appflow and it's ready to submit and ready for my testers. So all of this can be automated again within the dashboard using this kind of simple interface where you select your target platform, your build type, and then for App Store or release builds, you can distribute to a certain destination. All right. So we covered a lot today. We covered test devices. We covered automated and real and manual testing. We covered how you can deliver to manual testers. I want to cover a few key strategies for how you can start to implement some of the things that you've learned and take these strategies back to your team. The first is to leverage web testing whenever possible. If you are building a cross-platform app, you know, with Ionic Capacitor or even something like React Native, anytime that you can leverage mobile web browser testing first, you can help you really save time and resources. This is because it allows you to identify bugs earlier before you compile to native binaries. So if you're developing cross-platform, if you're able to leverage mobile web testing in order to cover the main use cases, then you can just really focus the real device testing on platform differences and performances. You know, just use that for those edge cases that are going to make or break you on those specific platforms. Next, I recommend automating your builds and deploys whenever you can. This allows you to reduce the operations overhead for the developers and testers on your team. This means that you don't have to spend as much time trying to configure all their builds and figure out what version that you're matching up to. Everything is automated. You can also automate those version and build ID updates to keep your test results organized. And this helps you to reduce knowledge silos in the team and give everybody a same viewpoint of what's happening. Anyone can go in and see what deployments have been made. And then also you want to deploy frequently. You know, the earlier that you find issues, the better. You can also leverage live updates for non-native updates and bug fixes. This allows you to push updates to HTML, CSS, JavaScript in your app without going through the App Store approval process. Because the smaller that your changes are, the easier it is for debugging. And it also gives you more data for analytics and optimization. The more frequently that you deploy, the more frequently you can identify areas where you can improve performance, improve your build times, anything that you can do to optimize. All right, so last but certainly not least, I'm really excited to bring Ashwini back to talk about a new feature coming in Appflow. And I'm super excited about this because it allows you to test native iOS and Android builds in Appflow. So Ashwini, can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Cecilia, for covering all the great content. There was so much to take in, and I'm sure that the people listening are definitely going to benefit from everything you shared. But I'm equally excited to announce a great partnership that we're adding to Appflow and integrating a platform Appetize to basically extend the testing capabilities. So with Appetize, you can now actually do all these testing options that Cecilia talked about right in your browser. So you don't, the simulators and emulators and requiring those devices to do that, you can take it all away and now just use Appflow and Appetize to do everything directly in the browser. So we're going to do a quick demo for you and kind of show you how that all works. And we are really excited about it as well. So Cecilia, if you want to bring up the demo.
Yeah, absolutely. Give me 1 second here to get that queued up.
While she's getting that queued up, as you can see, Appetize does offer you an option to do all your testing right in your browser. So you don't need to depend on having the Android Studio or Xcode available, similar to install to do your testing. And it does bring up ability to give you some debugging features as well that would normally be only available if you're using those emulator and simulators. So right here in this demo, we're going to start off with the app, and in Appflow, you have this commit. You pick your commit and pick your stack and pick the simulator build or simulator preview option. And this kicks off the simulator build for your application. Now, this is where it's getting requested. It will get picked up by our backend, Appflow's backend, to start building the simulator application, and it's going to create an artifact. Normally, without the support in browser testing support, once this artifact is ready, you would have to download it on your local device, have available Xcode and simulators available, and to be able to test it. So you're very limited to what you can do and who can do it. We're going to wait for this build to kind of run and finish. It doesn't take that long, but while this is running, here you can see, you get a build ID assigned. You can see what platform it is, what build stack you use to create that build. And once this is complete, you can see all the details in the log. And when this is ready to go, you will see those artifacts show up here available for you to download. So you can go down the manual route testing at that point by downloading it, but we'll have an even better option where once this is ready, as you can see, successful, you get that device preview option right here on the right-hand side. And when you click that right here in the browser, you can just quickly start testing your application. So this is defaulting to a specific device type, but you can pick another devices. You get option to test in various different orientations. You can even test your networking logs if you need to test any networking specific functionality. And this is a very simple app for coffee, like if I want to make coffee, how much coffee to water ratio I should use. But the goal here is to show you that it's really easy to just launch your app in the browser right then and there and start testing without needing anything. So this test flight scenario that Cecilia discussed earlier, that kind of happens later in the process, requires certificates and profiles. You can bring all that way up in the process and quickly get to your testing and debugging through this tool that we currently have it available. So here I'm demoing an iOS application, but you can do the exact same thing with Android too. So then it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of who can access it. You can share this URL with external testers and they can jump on the testing right away. And you do not have to wait testing that to a test flight or Play Store in a later stage of your application development. So I'm switching really quick into showing you how this works exactly similarly for an Android application as well. So I have a pre-built application. Here you can scan the QR code to download the APK on your file directly, or you go down the route of browser testing as well, where you now have a different device to choose from. It installs your app and you can test right then and there as well. You can also do some screenshots with this tool. So if you need to run some changes by your design team or anything like that, you can quickly share that and even get that testing underway here as well. So that was really a quick demo of how we are looking forward to extending your testing abilities with Appflow with Appetize. And I think it's super neat. So we can't wait to launch it here in a few weeks.
Awesome. That is super exciting. So excited to dig into that. I know that for me, dealing with the emulators and the simulators, I've had issues, for example, with Android emulators of the new version not appearing. Like when I go to load my new app, it's still showing the old one. And I have to wipe the device and it doesn't work that, as well. So being able to see the actual everything in the browser within Appflow, and then also be able to do it right from my build and not have to upload that binary and then go back and find it and track it down. Everything is there in one screen and one platform for me. So super excited to see that. And thanks so much, Ashwini, for sharing that. So,
I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
One-click testing you can beat one-click testing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it's now we do you have some time for some questions? I do see them kind of rolling in on the chat and the Q&A. Looks like there's some interesting things, or people are interested in kind of what we talked about today. So I'm going to grab some here from the Q&A and from the chat. So one is, how is Appetize different than the web preview? And and another question related to Appetize that I'll cover here is, how is it different from Sauce Labs? So it is different than web preview because web preview is actually showing the mobile web build of your application, right? So when you go into build an Appview or in Appflow, you have the option for a web build, an iOS build, or an Android build. Appetize is showing the actual native iOS and Android build of your application, not the mobile web version. It's also running the actual simulator and emulator there in the browser within Appflow for you. This allows you to change the type of device that you're using. You can access the network information. You can better simulate all of those specific hardware differences across platforms versus the mobile web version, which is going to be the same across any type of platform. It's different than Sauce Labs as well in that you have access to the build that you just created. You don't have to upload the binary. You don't have to track it down. You don't have to configure any kind of API. You're able to just take what you just built and view it and be able to interact with that simulator and emulator. And it's also nice because you can choose the devices and swap between device types on one screen. You don't have to continually go back and select a new type of device and reload the application. So I'm really excited to play around with it more and see how that works. We are getting some questions around, like when it'll be available, like do I have to have a certain subscription level? I think all of that is maybe yet to come, but Ashwini, do you have any details maybe on like who would have access to this feature once it is released?
Yeah, we will be doing an open beta, so anybody who has access to native build functionality in Appflow will initially have access to it. But the feature will be open for testing for everybody as we gather user feedback on how this solves your pain points and needs. Once we have that in there, we will figure out what the long-term plan for the feature is.
Awesome, good to know. So definitely stay tuned and make sure that you're keeping up to date on all the Appflow news that comes out. There's a couple questions about enterprise builds. So some of y'all are using enterprise certificates when you're signing your iOS builds. So you can also absolutely do enterprise builds within Appflow. So if you have that set up, enterprise builds do require that kind of enterprise setup with the Apple Developer Program. But if you have that set up, you can definitely do those types of builds in Appflow as well. So if you already have a workflow that involves creating enterprise builds, you can complete those builds within Appflow and replace that part of your existing workflow by leveraging Appflow functionality. And then there are some questions here. Yes, about sorry, can we debug iOS and Android apps from Appetize? Yeah, so the nice thing is, if you saw like in the video, there was like that debug log. So you do get access to information about like the network requests. You can even throttle networks, but you do also see any of the debug logs that appear. I don't know about you, but having to get debug information off of a simulator or emulator and then extract that out can be a little bit tricky and painful, depending on where the message appears. So being able to see that right underneath the device as I'm interacting with it is one of the helpful things to be able to debug within the browser. And again, if you are currently trying to distribute these binaries to testers, they all have to have everything configured, all the emulators and simulators configured on their machine. This removes that requirement. Okay, so kind of just taking a look at some of the other questions that popped up here. We have quite a few. And then let's see if there's any in the
I can answer this one. Can a user who does not have Appflow login can access Appetize URL? Yes, there is an option for public URLs that you can share with the extended testing team or users that don't have access to Appflow, and that's great because that's the external testers capability that TestFlies offers that you can now bring in at a much earlier stage of your application development to get that feedback sooner than later.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Ashwini, for that information. That's really helpful. Yeah, and just to clarify, because I see a lot of questions around like the CLI and running in CI/CD. So when we talk about Appflow, Appflow is that ability to automate your cloud native builds, upload to app stores, and then also push live updates. And that functionality is available in the dashboard. So when I showed like how you can build out your automation screen, you can see all your builds, all that is available in the dashboard. And then we also do have the Ionic Cloud CLI, which allows you to interact with that functionality via CLI. And what that means is that you can use that CLI in any type of environment. So if you have a more complex workflow, if you need to do other things besides just build and upload, then you can run your tests. You can, if you want to run web tests, if you want to run Appium tests, if you want to do static analysis, anything that you would want to do as part of a workflow, you can do that as you prefer with your own tools, but then leverage Appflow for the builds, the uploads, and the live updates. So we allow you to bring that functionality into any CI/CD platform that you're already using to design out your workflows. So if you want to run your Xcode unit tests, if you want to run Cypress tests for web, Appium tests, all of that can be orchestrated in any GitHub or any CI/CD provider that you choose. And then we will give you the functionality to be able to do those builds and uploads. All right, so answering a couple of questions there. And then there is a question here about any tips for creating meaningful automated UI tests? What type of assertions do you make? How do you handle async web calls? So I will say, so I come from like a web testing background, and so have answered a lot of these types of questions. And honestly, it depends on your test cases and what it is that you are looking to interact with. I would say if you start with very strongly defined test cases for your use cases, and then go from there in terms of what are the behavioral things that your user will need to step through for your UI, and assert on that. So I tend to do behavior-based assertions based on those use cases. As far as async web calls, a lot of the testing frameworks such as Playwright and Cypress for web testing both allow you to intercept web calls in order to either wait for them or to be able to validate a response coming back. And so I would leverage some of that tooling in order to make sure that API calls have completed before you proceed with UI testing. Hopefully that's helpful. If actually I've done a lot of testing stuff, so if you kind of look into there's a lot of resources out there. Okay. Is it possible to generate binaries for native tests as Espresso and XC unit test on Appflow and access it through Jenkins, for example? Yes, so we do have native support for native build support for native platforms. So if you have a, for example, like a native Android app or a native iOS app built with Swift or Kotlin or whatever it may be, you can also build those apps in Appflow. So it doesn't have to be a cross-platform app. We support obviously Ionic capacitor React Native, but also native Android and iOS. So you can generate those binaries within Appflow and then be able to pull down those binaries wherever you need. So if you're using the CLI, you can use your Jenkins pipeline, you can create the builds, you can get the binaries back in Jenkins wherever you need, or you can also at any time always go into the dashboard and download those binaries as well. All right, so I know we only have a few minutes left, and there's still, hopefully we've been able to, let's see, Appium for Android tests. Yes, so Appium can be used for Android and iOS tests, that is correct. You can even use the same tests and then just change the platform. So in the object, the capabilities that I showed where I was stating the platform of Android, as long as there's no platform specific behavior in that test, you could run the same test on Android or iOS. And there's a question about, do you still need Xcode to build your app? So no, so you can use Appflow to build on any, and you don't need to have Xcode, you don't need to have a Mac machine to generate iOS builds. Everything is using Appflow servers. We also manage all the build stacks for you. So we manage the dependencies that you need, like what version of Xcode you need, what version of Android SDK that you need. So you can trigger it from a Windows or Linux box. Everything is done on our end. Okay, awesome. So yeah, we're getting close to the end. Just kind of taking a look at whatever questions that we haven't been able to answer. And a couple questions around automated tests and Appetize. So Appetize is used for manual testing. You are interacting with that device, that simulated device, in order to do some manual testing. For automated testing, you do need a test framework. You need something to drive the device to do all the clicks and to do all the swipes and the scrolls and everything. So you will need to use a testing framework in order to do any kind of automated testing. Appetize is the way that you're able to open and interact with a simulator or emulator within Appflow. And then one last question here, are emulators and simulators reliable tools to test UI of cloud native apps? It depends. It depends. It depends on the complexity of your app. It depends on how much of the UI is tied to like any kind of native functionality that would require the hardware to be able to interact with it. Like I said, if the majority of your app is a cross-platform app that leverages web technologies, you can get away with a lot of web testing. You can get away with a lot of simulators and emulators to do that UI testing. It gets more, and then use real devices for those edge cases for those specific native issues. So awesome.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate having this time with you here today. I have seen some questions about if there will be a recording. Absolutely, this entire presentation has been recorded and you will receive that in the post-event email. So you'll receive that directly via email, but just in case if you want to reference any of our other previous webinar recordings, we always upload them directly to our site, ionic.io. And if you're subscribed to our YouTube channel, if not, I definitely recommend that you do because there's a lot of content on there as well. And we always upload our webinar recordings to our YouTube channel at Ionic Framework. So multiple ways in finding today's recording today. But as always, we definitely hope to see you on the next one. Huge shout out to Cecilia and Ashwini. Thank you so much for today's presentation.
And thanks, Diana. It's great being here. Thank you, everyone.
It happened.